So we've been hearing from the last speaker about some of the issues with Parliament and politicians. Who better then to continue the discussion as somebody who has had a distinguished career in the House of Westminster. Tom Levitt had a number of years as MP, served on various committees, and since then he has been putting more of his efforts into different areas of society, which you'll hear about. And he's also going to talk about something which so far hasn't had much attention in this conference, which is the role of business to accelerate some of the goals that we all have in mind. So please give a warm welcome to Tom Levitt.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, and good morning. Yes, I was 13 years a Member of Parliament, so I'm not sure, that was up until 2010, so I'm not sure if I'm talking today on behalf of Tweedledum or Tweedledee, but nevertheless, tempting though it is to start my discourse with an antithesis to some of Derek's theses, nevertheless, I will resist that temptation and get on with my what I came here to talk about. Because I've had 13 years in Parliament, because I had a career before that as a school teacher, because I've always been involved in charities, I've never actually worked for big business. Indeed, my one-man company now for the last 7 years is my only direct contact of being employed by it. I think that means I can be a little objective, but I think it also means that I can bring the experience of public sector and of the charitable voluntary sector to play in my analysis of where we're going, what we're doing and what needs to be done. I'm going to suggest that business doing good is doing good business, that this is not a luxury, this is not an option, an optional extra for us, but actually it's essential that the powers that exist within business are focused more acutely on the problems of the planet, the nation, the community, and indeed on business itself. What's nice about this, I hope you'll agree by the time I finish talking, is that if you can back that idea up with a business case, in other words, to make it clear to business why it makes sense to them to behave in the ways which I'm going to discuss, then you have a way of making it sustainable. And I do recognise, David, that the danger of techno-utopianism, and I hope I don't fall into that trap. I'm very optimistic that I won't need to. So, like any good story about the future, this one starts in the past, and I'm going to choose a fairly arbitrary date, although Derek's already mentioned it, as being the date in which 1984 was published. It's also the date when Land Rover was launched for the first time, when Gandhi was killed, and when the Windrush arrived at Tilbury. So quite a few things were happening at that moment. But I want to focus on one event, which was one of the biggest charitable events in history at that point, when someone donated a piece of land. That man was Rockefeller. He was donating a patch of New York real estate, and the first sod was turned that year in the building of the United Nations headquarters. The United Nations, in one form or another, had already been around for a little while, but it had its own distinct headquarters from 1948, when 58 countries came together to talk about the problems of the world. And this was, they were there because they were the leading economies. They were the movers and shakers. They were the ones who took it upon themselves to take responsibility for helping the world collectively to organise its future. And the things that they wanted to talk about were post-war reconstruction, obviously, plus migration, health. The World Health Organization was set up that year, and human rights. And they also integrated that year into the United Nations the International Labour Organization on workers' rights, which had been going since 1919. So pulling all of those things together, the leading economies of the world were coming together to take upon themselves some responsibility. And they happened to be all countries. And they took that agenda on. In 1963, John Kennedy is best known for having died that year, but I want to focus on something he said that year. And that was that we have the power to rid this planet of hunger within a decade. All we need, he said, is the will. Well, 50-odd years on, the will has clearly not yet been sufficient. And that's because, by and large, governments haven't come together effectively enough to do something about it. Stockholm in 1972, Derek said he didn't get on to talking about climate change. Well, the world started talking about climate change in 1972. And again in Rio in 1992. And then by the time of the millennium, the United Nations launched its Millennium Development Goals. 8 areas of public policy where the world, the countries of the world, the big economies of the world were going to come together and make a difference. We didn't stop talking about climate change. Kyoto came up. And then in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, which reflected upon the success of 15 years of work on the Millennium Development Goals and took that a stage further. But it took it a stage further in what I think is a really, really interesting way. And that is that there are some goals in the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals which cannot be achieved without the engagement of business. Indeed, some of them refer very specifically to the operation of business. Before moving on to the next slide, we then come to the most significant climate change discussions of the lot, the COP21 in Paris, which I hope to show brought about real change, but they did that not because they relied on governments, but because they engaged with business. So today, if we look at some of the headlines that we see, just about 6 weeks ago, the 100th corporate commitment under the Paris Agreement to go zero carbon within 10 years. Some of the names on that list of 100 will not be surprising. Microsoft and Apple were up there towards the beginning, but in July there was a rush. Now, one of my little hobbies is to be a member of a group called the AGM Army, and through the charity Share Action, we send people to corporate AGMs and we ask embarrassing questions. And I was at the AGM of Schroders, the investment house, in July. And I asked the question, will you give a commitment to zero carbon in all of your operations worldwide? And they stood up and they said, yes. And they were the 93rd company to do that. And I was really quite surprised. You know, how do you then come back with your supplementary question when everything you wanted to hear has been embodied in one word? But basically what they said was, we are hereby announcing that by 2022 we will be carbon neutral across Europe, and by 2025 we'll be carbon neutral across the world. Now that's the sort of commitment that companies have been giving. That same week, 2 days later, Tesco, the second biggest retailer in the world, made its commitment, I think to 2024, to become carbon neutral globally. So this is a movement, and it's a movement which businesses are getting involved in and latched onto because it makes sense to them in their business case for them to do so. Who would today want to invest in oil? It's going to run out, it's going to get more expensive, it's going to become increasingly available only from politically sensitive areas, and it just does not make sense, which is why in 3 or 4 years ago, Bill Gates said he thought that disinvestment in carbon was a waste of time, and yet last year his own charitable foundation completed 100% disinvestment in carbon. So he changed his mind over the course of just the last couple of years. It's not all plain sailing. There are some bad apples in the barrel. Volkswagen lying about its emissions. On NOx in particular, nitrous oxides. They were punished in the marketplace. They were punished in the American courts. They may yet be punished in the European courts. And certainly it's going to cost them an awful lot of money to put those lies right. So they can't get away with it. And increasingly we see that companies who do try to get away with not doing the right thing are caught out. Here's an interesting one. 30 years ago, if you talked about rare earths, you would have thought back to your A-level chemistry. You wouldn't have thought to yourself, the mobile phone industry uses all 17 of the rare earth elements. They were not, well, China and America were basically the only places producing them 30 years ago. America produces hardly any now. The vast majority come from China. But they're in short supply. And one of the reasons they're in short supply now is because about a third of all the mobile phones that have ever been produced, and there's now more mobile phones than people on the planet, actually are sitting in drawers somewhere, not being recycled and not having those entirely recyclable minerals taken out of them and used again. Derek again mentioned water. Only for the last 3 years has the World Economic Forum highlighted water as a top 3 global issue. But it's going to stay there as an issue because it is absolutely crucial, not just to human life, but to the operation of business also in so many parts of the world. Parts of California, the ground level has fallen by 8 meters. That's more than the height of this room, simply because of the water that's been taken out of the ground. Thank you. We've got the highest ever migration rates. We get about 0.5% of all world migrants coming to this country. The vast majority of migrants stay within their country or the one next to it, but they pose huge issues, both in losing workforce from places and for needing to find jobs in others. IKEA has announced plans to employ 200,000 migrants over the next 10 years in the places where the demand is greatest. They've started that off with a big production facility in Jordan, which is mostly working with Syrian migrants, where the workforce will be half local people and half migrants. They're seeing the business case for doing that. And then, looking back to Britain, UK poverty has doubled, say Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Yes, it has, and the main reason why that has happened is a huge rise of in-work poverty. And that's something business can really do something about. In-work poverty is when you take home at the end of the week not enough money to be able to survive on. And that has happened over the last 10 years. It's happened since the crash. In-work poverty was almost insignificant 10 years ago. It's vastly increased since then. What's also increased since then is the difference between the highest paid in the country and the lowest paid in the country. The highest paid have seen their pay roughly double in the last 10 years. The lowest paid in work in this country have seen their buying power fall in the last 10 years. That's, again, something business can do something about. And got halfway through the talk without mentioning Trump. Trump has threatened to pull out of COP21, the climate change, by 2019. It doesn't matter. The reason it doesn't matter is because American business, and you saw this when he made the announcement, American business and the American investment community in particular have already decided that low carbon and renewable energy is the way forward, and it almost doesn't matter that the president isn't on board, because the vast majority of big business, the vast majority of American mayors, the vast majority of small businesses are on board. And there are states in America now, traditionally coal-producing states, where there are more people employed in renewable energy and in energy use reduction than there are in the carbon industries. Now, let's go back to that idea of the world's big economies coming together. In 1948, that was 58 countries coming together. Today, if you looked at the 100 biggest economies in the world, you'd still have 58 countries, but you'd have 42 companies there as well. That's what's really changed in the last 70 years. Walmart is the world's biggest company with a turnover of $500 billion. By the way, when I talk about company size, I'm comparing country GDP with company turnover. There are other ways of doing it, like market capitalization, which will show all the technology companies being huge. using turnover, you get a rather more balanced picture, I think. But who would have thought that there'd be 5 Chinese companies in there, about 15 American companies out of those 42. The biggest British company is BP, and it's, I think actually it's the only, no it's not, it's one of the very, very few, I think there are 3 UK-based companies in that list of 42. Interestingly, the 100th biggest company on that measure is exactly the same size as the 100th biggest country. And without going into a guessing game, let me tell you it's Cameroon and Royal Dutch Philips, the electrical company from Holland. Now, why is this in business interests? Because business isn't going to be a positive partner in this unless it is in business interest. Well, I would suggest there are 3 cases which justify this. And I'll just give you an example of each one. Let's take health in this country. The biggest cause of lost time, that's lost productivity to business, is health issues. The amount of time lost through industrial disputes is minuscule compared to health. And even within health, thank you, even within health, there is far more time now lost to mental health issues than there is to physical health issues. And when someone is off with a mental health problem, they take longer time off than someone with a physical problem does. So for those reasons, you can see why it makes sense for business to reduce the impact of mental health on their operations. Just to take that a stage further, business has got to be concerned about the issues which cause mental health problems, about the management of mental health problems in the workplace, but crucially, about the way people who've been off on mental health problems are then reintegrated into the workforce. None of those things are done particularly well by enough businesses. But actually, if they did that properly, look at the burden on the NHS that would be removed. And the business case for doing that is that you're increasing productivity, you're getting back that working time that you're otherwise losing. The second argument I would say is the moral case. And that is that we all live together or one example of a moral case would be that we all live together in a society where not only is poverty increasing, as we've seen, but ageing is also increasing. And that poses real challenges to all of us, whatever sector of the community we're in. And yet, to pick one example, business approach to paying tax, which pays traditionally for those services, is ambiguous in some cases, to say the least. And so therefore, I think there has to be, the local authorities are now permitted to ask companies which are bidding for tenders to qualify for the fair tax mark. In other words, to make a public announcement that they believe in paying their fair share of tax, and they are paying their fair share of tax. And there's certainly a very good reputational reason for doing that. And the business case, I've mentioned several cases of that already, but doing well on the issues which we've been talking about enhance the company's reputation, but they also include enhancing employee engagement. And I'm not talking here about what I regard as superficial CSR operations. I'm talking about instilling purpose, instilling mission in what a company does, because there's a business case for doing that. The business case is 3 particular examples of this, all worth looking up if you're not familiar with any of them. The circular economy, which minimises waste. The inclusive economy, which says, look, if we've got lots of poor people, then we have a dysfunctional market. Poor people are not part of the market. We need to get them into that market. And there's some lovely stories which I'd love to tell you if I only had time on how that can be done. And the social economy is essentially the one that says we as a business put our social purpose as a higher priority than the maximisation of profit. We see that through social enterprises, to some extent through the B Corp movement, but also through mainstream operations such as Unilever. And I'm going to move on to my last slide, and that is to suggest that there are 3 duties and 6 responsibilities which we should expect business to discharge. The first of those duties is what I call an internal duty, and they are very, very traditional. So traditional that the duty to the market is something that Adam Smith talked about in the 1700s. It basically says if you're not producing something you can sell, you're not going to survive as a business. That's true. And then in the 1960s, Friedman talked about the priority of profit and the need to make a profit. And actually he's right. If you're not making a profit, the only true not-for-profits are charities and bankrupts. And so therefore it is necessary to make a return, at least on the investment. But where I differ from Smith and Friedman there is to say that it doesn't end there. In fact, since the Second World War, we've seen a much greater emphasis on the priority given to business to other stakeholders. Now, they could be the employees, they could be the customers, but they could also be more widely government and so on. And in particular case of government, it's that paying of tax. And it isn't just paying tax, it's the attitude with which you pay tax, which I count as being part of this external duty. And that says that if we are going to be afforded the right to be seen as company citizens, if businesses want to be known as company citizens and to be playing their role thereby, they have to pay a fair amount of tax. Now that, of course, means there has to be a fair tax system for which them to do it. But this would mean that there would be there'd be moral pressure not to either evade or avoid tax. And finally, 2 universal responsibilities. One is to the community, which is simply saying being a good neighbour. Wherever the impact of your business falls, then you have a responsibility to work with people in those circumstances to make sure that your negative impacts are minimised and your positive impacts are maximised. And the last one is to the future. And by the future, this is the absolutely crucial one, I believe, and both the previous speakers have touched upon this. The reason we had many of the problems that I've mentioned here, many of which have been caused by business, but the reason those problems exist is because of the short-term thinking that's gone on. If we think long-term, first of all, investing in solar panels on your roof makes a lot more sense if you're paying them off over 20 years than over 2 years. But that long-term thinking is actually something which business can do. And for reasons Derek hinted at, government actually can't do, because it's restricted by that 4 or 5 year cycle of elections. Neither of those statements is absolutely true, but you can see what I mean. And the beauty of this, from a business point of view, most companies, I think, are in the process of moving on from just the internal duties to take on board some of those external duties. But very, very few have actually taken that final step. There was a report out only last week suggesting that the company in the world that's doing the most on that is Unilever. But there are others up there like Nike, like IKEA, which are looking to do the same sort of thing. Just remember, in this country, by the way, 99% of all businesses are small businesses. They're not the corporates. And there's a whole other story to be told about them, but I don't have time to do it. The beauty of this model is that there's then a feedback mechanism, because I think actually it makes business sense. You can make more profit out of thinking long term and engaging with the community than by doing otherwise. So let's get rid of short-termism. Let's think more in terms of long-termism. Let's go away from that Friedmanite view of business. Let's embrace what we can do together with business and emphasise throughout that the business case for being a good citizen, because they ain't going to deliver without that. Thank you.
Thank you. So Tom, the kind of top questions are about why aren't more companies seeing it like this? And you've outlined a case, but it seems that many companies are still lagging behind, thinking of the present rather than the future. They're being reactive rather than proactive. Why don't more of them see this vision, or is it just a matter of time before more of them will buy in?
I think there is an acceleration, and I think that there have been instances where people can now learn. So Paul Polman was recruited to Unilever to behave in exactly the way he has been behaving, to make the maximum use of resources, to reduce waste, but also to deliver a social mission. Interestingly, I think Anthony Jenkins at Barclays was recruited to do a very similar thing after a very difficult time for Barclays, but he was then shoved out because they lost their nerve and they wanted to revert back to the profit maximisation. But as we see companies behaving in these sort of ways, and being successful in business terms by doing so, I think that message will get out there faster and faster. We've seen that with the Responsible 100, but there are other sort of league tables which are being generated on different issues as we speak almost.
There's a question actually about Paul Polman, saying, look, he's saying all the right things, but even he can't get his company to commit to being a B Corp, which is a for-benefit company. So is he finding it impossible, or is it that there's many ways to go forwards and you don't all need to have every company signed up legally as a benefit corporation, which means that your legal objective isn't just to make profits for your shareholders, but you've got other attributes as well?
I'm delighted that this question's come up. I love B Corp. My last book, called Welcome to Good Co, there's one or two flyers on the thing outside, on the desk outside, talks about the B Corp movement. Look, the benefit corporation movement was started about 15 years ago in America, and it was brought about because it was not legally possible to run a company which did not have maximisation of profit as your goal. And they fought a very good campaign, and they managed to get a number of states, not very many, but a number, to recognise benefit corporation as a legal model. Then they got Delaware, and Delaware is where 80% of all American companies are registered. So the benefit corporation model is now available throughout America. There are now 1,500 benefit corporations in the whole world. There's also, that's not a lot, by the way. There's also another movement that sprung from that called the B Corp movement, which is an accreditation process rather than a legal definition of a process. And the B Corp movement, again, the first ones in this country were about 12 years ago. 2 years ago, they had 8 in this country. Then they had a big push. They've now got about 100. But for the last year, it stayed at about 100. Look at the Community Interest Company, launched in 2004 in this country. 13,000 social enterprises committed to community benefit. So the B Corp movements are for profit, and that's absolutely fine. But what I'm saying is that they are almost a pinprick. In this country, you do not need the legal status of benefit corporation because you can behave like one without actually being one, legally speaking. So therefore, I'm not surprised it's not taken off. And whilst it's a great movement, and I'd encourage people to look at it, it's not the answer to everything. Making the business case for all businesses to behave well is more important than joining a particular elite. Though I should say that what was the biggest B Corp in the world until recently was Ben & Jerry's, and of course that is part of Unilever.
You got until halfway through your talk before you mentioned the T word, Trump. We've come all this way, I think, without mentioning the G word, Google. But there is a top-rated question about Google. It says, it's all well and good having companies that talk grandly. Why shouldn't we be pressurising Google and the likes of other companies like it to pay more of their fair share of taxes?
Well, absolutely, of course we should. I went to an event at the Google headquarters a couple of years ago, and I tweeted, here I am at Britain's largest non-profit organisation. Brackets, if it made a profit, it would pay tax, close brackets. Which is perhaps a naive assumption. The problem is they do it because they can, and all sorts of they avoid tax because they can. And all sorts of good things that Google does, grants it gives and whatever, to my mind is no substitute for paying a fair rate of tax. But until we have an international system which doesn't harmonise tax, but does does stop the sort of loopholes to arise where people can simply relocate to another country on paper in order to avoid paying any tax at all, then we're going to have to take steps along that route as well. Until then, only moral pressure, I think, can bring people like Google to think more seriously about this. But yes, the question is absolutely right.
And the final question, and for those of you who are not sure, I'm taking the questions that have been submitted online via the Glissa pages, and there's information about how to access that on the handout that you picked up at reception. Another question about tax, and is the money we pay in tax well spent? Perhaps businesses should be doing the tasks of health and education instead of government and doing a better job of it.
How long have I got?
30 seconds.
Right. I think the days of big providers of public services have gone. I think the public services of the future will be much more locally delivered. Government's role will be much more of a coordinating role to make sure there are no gaps than it has been in the past. I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned, both from the successes and the failures of how outsourcing services has gone in the past. We don't tend to outsource services very well. But if you look, for example, at care of the elderly, there are quite a few cases where small businesses, maybe with 6 houses across a town, a business has been set up to look after people who need intense care within their homes. I don't mean intensive medically, but you know, proper support within their homes. And they're doing that as a private business, and they're taking all of the advantages of technology to cut down costs and to not cutting down the care, but cutting down the costs by using IT to its best to coordinate what happens in those houses across that town and deliver levels of care which are not otherwise being provided. So I think that saying we've got to end public provision and go inside the private sector is just as wrong as saying that something like delivering care can only ever be done by the public sector. So it's going to be, in future, much more of a coordinated, local solutions for local problems, not just in care, but in other forms as well. A really good example of that would be energy. I want every street to have its own power station, by which I mean, of course, a renewable one, rather than having to rely on huge energy companies.
So the solution is going to come from using many kinds of energies and resources. It's not just politicians, it's not just business, it's not just local, it's not just in big international corporations.
No, but it's all of them working together and looking for appropriate local solutions which deliver for the citizens, and by that word I'm including people, institutions, and, where appropriate, businesses.
Tom Levitt, thank you very much.
Thank you.